All right, everybody, welcome and good morning to our Grand Rounds presentation. We have two wonderful outside speakers giving us a presentation this morning. Dr. Oliva actually met them at APA, and we're happy to have them here virtually at the University of Louisville. So Dr. Kayla Fisher completed her psychiatric residency at Loma Linda University, followed by a child fellowship at the University of Southern California. When her career path led her to leadership positions in forensic hospitals, Dr. Fisher decided to complete a Juris Doctorate and then completed a forensic fellowship at Case Western Reserve University under tutelage of Dr. Phil Resnick. Dr. Fisher is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology with certifications in general psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and forensic psychiatry. Recognized as a distinguished member of the American Psychiatric Association, she serves on the executive committee for the APA Caucus for Psychiatry, Religion, and Spirituality, as well as the Ethics Committee for the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists. Additionally, she chairs the Forensic Hospital Services Committee for the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. Dr. Fisher has written on a variety of psychiatric topics and regularly provides lectures at national meetings, including the APA, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists, and the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. She also lectures internationally, with most recent presentations occurring in India, Israel, Italy, Philippines, and Portugal. Since 2022, Dr. Fisher has served on the editorial board for the Psychiatrist in Practice examination, also referred to as PIPE or PIPE. Dr. Fisher is a clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside, where she teaches and mentors psychiatry residents. She also maintains a private forensic practice. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And since we're going to do our presentations kind of back to back, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Sarathy. So Dr. Sarathy completed both undergraduate and medical school at Texas A&M University. She then completed her psychiatry residency training as well as her fellowship in forensic psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. After spending the first several years of her career doing state hospital work, she transitioned into correctional psychiatry with the County of Riverside in Riverside, California. There, she oversaw psychiatry for all 5 of the county's jails as the Associate Medical Director for Forensics. While there, she also built the county's first felony incompetent to stand trial diversion program to aid with California's growing state hospital waiting list. After recent relocating to Colorado Springs, she's transitioning to private practice. And I have to tell you a personal note about Dr. Sarathy. When I was doing my forensic fellowship at Case with Phil Resnick, he mentioned to us that he had this unusually capable resident that would be joining us, essentially doing the fellowship in addition to her residency requirements. And it was there that I got to know her, and she kept up with us, and we had to basically keep up with her much of the time. So I'm delighted to present with her today. So she's going to start us off with our presentation, Behind the Incel Movement, the Misogyny, and the Violence.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Fisher. And thank y'all for having us today. We're very happy to be here. Let me start by sharing my screen and make sure I do this correctly. And everyone can see my slides okay?
Yes, you were good.
Perfect. All right. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start all of us off today by talking about the history of misogyny, how it's evolved, and how our current climate in this country can support and even foster a movement such as the incel movement. Because some might wonder, how do we get a misogynistic movement such as incel in our society today? So let's explore why that happened and how that happened. So let's start with some definitions so we understand what these concepts are, because a lot of people don't actually understand what misogyny actually is, and they use the term misogyny interchangeably, incorrectly with the term sexism. So what is misogyny? Misogyny is the dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against women, and the origin is mid-17th century Greece. Misandry, on the other hand, is the dislike of, contempt for, ingrained prejudice against men. And the origin is actually later for this term in 19th century Greece. So what are some of the manifestations of misogyny that we see in society? Some of the manifestations are social exclusion, discrimination, hostility, sexual objectification, belittling, female disenfranchisement. And then there's this concept of androcentrism, which is the practice of, whether conscious or otherwise, placing a masculine point of view at the center of your worldview and the center of your culture and history. And by doing that, you marginalize femininity. On the opposite hand, gynocentrism is the opposite. It's placing a feminine point of view at the center of your worldview, and thereby you kind of marginalize masculinity. So what is the difference between misogyny and sexism? I mentioned earlier that people use them interchangeably, and that shouldn't happen because they are different. The term sexism was most likely coined in 1965 by a woman named Pauline Leet. Leet defined it by comparing it to racism when she said, when you argue that since fewer women write good poetry, this justifies their total exclusion, you're taking a position analogous to that of the racist. I might call you, in this case, a sexist. So sexism is based on traditional stereotypes of gender roles. And as you can see, this term developed much later than the term misogyny. Misogyny developed in ancient Greece, whereas sexism, the term was developed during the 1960s. So let's consider kind of the following example when we talk about double standards when it comes to sexism. A female and a male politician, they may say the same thing in a debate. But while the male will often be described as confident or passionate in what he says, the female is often described as aggressive or arrogant. And that's what it's the sexism that often leads to these double standards. Kate Mann is a Cornell philosophy professor, and she's also the author of a book called Down Girl: The Logic of Misogyny. She says that sexism is an ideology that says these arrangements just make sense. Women are just more caring, they're nurturing, they're more empathetic than men. So these arrangements make sense. That's how she describes sexism. Sexism is the ideology that supports the patriarchy, while misogyny is what enforces it when there's a threat to that system potentially going away. So she states that misogynistic behavior is really about hostility towards women who violate the normal stereotype of gender roles. So women who take what have traditionally been considered male positions appear abrasive, aggressive, and arrogant only because we expect them to be passive. Now, it's important to remember that misogynists are always sexist, but sexists are not always misogynist because sexists don't necessarily have that hatred for women. So a man who believes women should naturally be more maternal because they're female, he might be defined as a sexist, but he's not defined as a misogynist because he doesn't necessarily have that hatred or inherent prejudice against women. Now, I like to use this picture to illustrate the slippery slope between sexism and misogyny, because it is a slippery slope. It's not black and white, there's gray area. So on one hand of the picture, you see someone saying men are better at science and math than women. That's more of a sexist thing to say. It's based on these traditional gender stereotypes. Then you move to the middle and you see women are emotionally unstable. Now you're getting into a little bit of gray area. That's a little bit more than sexist. It's a little bit more prejudicial. And then you see on the right-hand side, it says women exist for the sexual pleasure of men. That's misogynistic. And so as you can see, it's kind of a slippery slope. It's not a clear delineation between sexism and misogyny. And so you really have to be careful what you're labeling as sexism versus what you're labeling as misogynistic. So let's talk more about the history of misogyny. And I'm going to take you through a journey through history to describe how it began and how it evolved. Misogyny originally dates back to ancient Greece. Hipponax was a Greek poet, and he lived around 540 BC. And some of his quotes include some interesting things, such as, "If only we could reproduce without woman." In his time, women were typically only seen valuable for their ability to reproduce and maintain a household. He was known to compare women to several types of animals, including a pig, where he describes woman as a slob that has no respect for herself or her appearance, to a fox as sly and unpredictable, and to a dog as just there to reproduce over and over. Interestingly enough, Aristotle was also accused of being a misogynist, and he called female an incomplete male or a deformity. Hipponax also said 2 days are sweetest for a woman, the day a man marries her and the day he carries her out dead. So as you can see, there was a lot of ill feeling towards women. So what was ancient Greece like? It was a highly patriarchal society that became increasingly misogynistic as democracy evolved and as a middle class emerged. The family unit became more important as the middle class arose. And because the nuclear family unit became more important, then these gender roles became more important, especially for the woman to maintain the household. Children belonged only to their father, not to their mother, and adultery was seen as a crime against the state only when women committed it, not when men committed it. So a woman committing adultery would either lose her citizenship or she'd be executed. Men, on the other hand, they had fully legal sexual outlets that weren't considered adultery, such as courtesans, prostitutes, and even engaging in sexual activities with other young male citizens. Many scholars believe that misogyny in ancient Greece was a result of this fear and distrust that men had towards women. So Greek men actually didn't usually marry until they were about 30. And that was late considering their life expectancy was about only 50 years old. And when they did marry, they chose brides who were 12 years old, 13 years old, 14 years old. So by the time they died, their brides were maybe in their 20s or 30s. So they structured their society so that they would actually never come into contact with adult women, which is very interesting because they were just so avoidant of having that experience of being with adult women. Citizen women were confined to domestic life. Non-citizen women could be courtesans, prostitutes, or midwives, nurses, things like that. Change finally occurred after the Romans conquered them, and then the family unit was no longer the key to citizenship. Sorry, my slide is not advancing. There we go. All right, so let's talk about misogyny in Greek mythology, because a lot of Greek mythology portrayed women as being deceitful, manipulative, and wanting to cause the downfall of men. And so it's felt by many people that the portrayal of women in Greek mythology fueled this improper treatment of women in ancient Greek society. So let's talk about Pandora, a plague upon men. It's one of the most recognizable stories of misogyny in ancient Greek mythology. It's the tale of Pandora's box. Many of us have heard that phrase, opening Pandora's box. Well, this is where it came from. It's talking about the greatest affliction to man, which is woman. Pandora was the first woman on earth created by the gods. She was actually created as a punishment to mankind because Zeus was mad at Prometheus for stealing fire from the gods. So Zeus presented Pandora to Prometheus's brother. She then opened a jar. And in this jar, it contained sickness, death, and other evils. And by opening the jar, she released all these evils into the world. But then she shut the jar before hope could escape from the jar to mitigate some of those effects of the evil. So again, this story is what gave rise to the idiom opening Pandora's box, which is associated with causing chaos and problems in the world. So Zeus then shouts at Prometheus saying, "You are glad that you have outwitted me and stolen fire. A great plague to you yourself and to men that shall be. But I will give men, as the price for fire, an evil thing in which they may be glad of heart while they embrace their own destruction." So Pandora was meant to destroy mankind. She was beautiful on the outside, but filled with chaos, tricks, and misery on the inside. Neither Zeus nor Prometheus were blamed for their part in bringing evil to the world. All the blame was placed on Pandora. In fact, not only was she to blame for opening the box to begin with, but she was to blame for shutting the box before hope could escape to save the world. Moving forward to ancient Rome, they had a similar shift in attitude regarding women as ancient Greece when the middle class began to rise to prominence. Fathers decided whether his children lived or died, and daughters were routinely put to death. Upper class daughters were named, while lower class daughters were only given a number to be identified. Men were allowed to kill their wives or daughters if they were found to be unchaste. Men could return women to their families if they didn't like them. Women were then then become an outcast if they were returned. And in Rome, if a woman was raped, she could be put to death by her father or husband. Moving forward to the 1400s, these were the rules of marriage written by Friar Cherubino of Siena. When you see your wife commit an offense, don't rush at her with insults and violent blows. Scold her sharply, bully and terrify her. And if this still doesn't work, take up a stick and beat her soundly. For it is better to punish the body and correct the soul than to damage the soul and spare the body. Then readily beat her, not in rage, but out of charity and concern for her soul, so that the beating will redound to your merit and her good. So as you can see, there was this real flavor of misogyny even in the 1400s. Moving forward a little bit, this is a picture of Sir William Blackstone, who's an English politician, jurist, and judge in the 1700s. And he commented on wives killing their husbands by saying, husband and wife, in the language of the law, are styled baron and femme. If the baron kills his femme, it's the same as if he had killed a stranger or any other person. But if the femme kills her baron, it is regarded by the laws as a much more atrocious crime, as she not only breaks through the restraints of humanity and conjugal affection, but throws off all subjection to the authority of her husband. And therefore, the law denominates her crime as a species of treason and condemns her to the same punishment as if she had killed the king. And for every species of treason, the sentence of woman was to be drawn and burnt alive. Bringing us to the US law and the history of law in this country, I want to highlight several points of time. In 1824, the Mississippi Supreme Court upheld the principle of a man's right to physically assault his wife as judged appropriate by the man. Then in 1864, the North Carolina court ruled on a man who choked his wife. The law permits the man to use towards his wife such a degree of force as is necessary to control an unruly temper and make her behave herself. Unless some permanent injury be inflicted or there be an excess of violence or such a degree of cruelty, the law will not invade the domestic forum or go behind the curtain. In 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment with citizens and voters defined as only male in the Constitution. And up until 1871, a man could not be punished for beating his wife with a stick, pulling her hair, choking her, spitting in her face, or kicking her about the floor. In 1871, it was actually Alabama that became the first state to rescind a husband's legal right to beat his wife by saying the wife is entitled to the same protection of the law that the husband can invoke for himself. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull becomes the first female presidential candidate. Also in 1872, Susan B. Anthony cast her first vote to test the 14th Amendment to see if it would be interpreted to women. It was not, and she was convicted of unlawful voting. In 1890, Wyoming becomes the first state to grant women the right to vote in all elections. And by 1900, every state had passed legislation granting married women the right to keep their own wages and own property. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin of Montana became the first woman elected to the House. And in 1918, Margaret Sanger, who many of us know that name, 2 years after opening a birth control clinic in Brooklyn, wins her lawsuit in New York to allow doctors to discuss birth control with patients. This clinic, of course, later became Planned Parenthood in 1942. And then in 1920, finally, the 19th Amendment is ratified, ensuring women's right to vote. In 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, promising equitable wages for the same work, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. And then in 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act passed, prohibiting sex discrimination in the workplace. 1965, the Supreme Court established the right of married couples to use contraception. And then, of course, in 1973, the landmark Supreme Court ruling of Roe v. Wade makes abortion legal. 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. And in 1986, the Supreme Court held that a work environment can be declared hostile or abusive due to sex discrimination. 1992 was the year of the woman. This is the year following the 1991 hearings in which the lawyer Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. A record number of women were elected to Congress this year. And in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act funded services for victims of rape and domestic violence. 1997 saw Madeleine Albright becoming the first female Secretary of State. And then, of course, in 2007, Nancy Pelosi became the first female Speaker of the House. In 2012, the Paycheck Fairness Act, which was meant to fight gender discrimination in the workplace, unfortunately failed in the Senate on a party line vote. So here we're going to see, a little bit of backtracking in recent years. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, of course, secured the Democratic presidential nomination. She became the first American woman to lead the ticket of a major party. We know the result of that election. And then finally, that brings me to more of the present day. In 2022, of course, we have the Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case, which overturned their precedent of Roe v. Wade. And I left this slide blank on purpose because I'd like to think that we're going to make some progress in the near future. And I hope that as Dr. Fisher and I continue to give this talk, I'll be able to add some good things to this slide. So I left it blank on purpose. So that brings me to the question, are men the problem? We've talked about the history of misogyny dating back to ancient Greece. Seems to always be men causing the issues, right? So that's the problem. Absolutely not. That is not the problem, which is gonna bring me to a different topic regarding misogyny, more of female misogyny and internalized misogyny. So let's look into that. I want to start talking about this concept by talking about this group called the Independent Women's Forum. This began as a group called Women for Judge Thomas in 1991. And it was a group that kind of led the fight to discredit and silence Anita Hill. And I just mentioned a couple of slides ago, she was the lawyer who accused Supreme Court nominee at the time, Clarence Thomas, of sexual harassment. This entire situation repeated itself with the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh as well. So this organization, supposedly founded by women, went on to become called the Independent Women's Forum, and it's considered a right-wing group that rallied support both for Justice Thomas as well as Justice Kavanaugh during their confirmation hearings. In fact, interestingly enough, this group, during the confirmation process for Justice Clarence Thomas, they released a list of women who signed an affidavit confirming that they had never been assaulted by Justice Thomas, and they used that as justification that he could not have assaulted Anita Hill because he didn't assault all these other women. That means he didn't assault Anita Hill. They used the same tactic actually with Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. The Independent Women's Forum is largely funded by the Koch brothers network of billionaires who've supposedly given them over $5 million. They were also supported by ExxonMobil and Rush Limbaugh, who, let's face it, isn't known for his feminist attitude. The majority of donors are actually men, which is interesting because even though it's called the Independent Women's Forum and it was supposedly founded by women, most of their positions on issues largely reflect the views of their male supporters, not necessarily female constituents. So what are their views? Some of the policies they oppose are equal pay advances, earned sick leave, paid parental leave, increased to minimum wage, and they oppose any policy to secure women's reproductive privacy and freedom. They actually lobbied against the Violence Against Women Act, declaring that wives instigate violence, including severe violence against husbands, more often than husbands do against wives. And we do know the statistics don't actually show that. But that is their position on that. They also believe that the problem of campus sexual violence is largely exaggerated. They have supported politicians who made comments such as pregnancy from rape is something that God intended to happen, and abortions to save a mother's life are never medically necessary. They argue that the gender gap in income exists only because women demand greater flexibility and fewer hours and less travel in their careers, rather than the gender gap in income is not due to sexism. It's just because of these demands on the part of women. Now you're looking at a very interesting map from 2016. And during this time, during the presidential election, there was a small faction of Trump supporters that tweeted the hashtag repeal the 19th to demand the repeal of the 19th Amendment, which, as we know, guaranteed the right to vote for women. So what triggered this hashtag? It was actually triggered by the release of this electoral map, which illustrates a Donald Trump victory if only men were to vote. There was another map released that showed a Hillary Clinton victory if only women voted. So to many Trump supporters, this male-only map was evidence that women were to blame if Trump lost the election. So what did some people say about this? Men should never have given women the right to vote. Repeal the 19th. Sounds like a feminist. I can't give you one good reason for women voting, but I will cry and report you for abuse. I would be willing to give up my right to vote to make this happen. So the many men who responded positively to this repeal, the 19th hashtag, it wasn't as surprising as these tweets because these were all women. Now, the Washington Post said that only about 100 of the tweets were genuinely serious about the repeal, but that was just among Twitter users. If there are 100 Twitter users that were serious about this, how many others out there agree? It's a scary thought. So what is this concept of internalized misogyny? It basically means that many women become programmed to believe in misogynistic points of view due to their environment and society reinforcing it. So we become programmed to believe the lies that we hear, and we subsequently alienate other women or even hate other women because they don't follow the social norms. And women who do this, they truly believe that women are inferior to men because that's what they've been taught, and they've been programmed to believe because they've seen it play out. There was a study done in 2009 that analyzed the conversations between 45 pairs of female friends, and they were analyzing it for comments related to sexism and misogyny. And what they found were the comments that were made were categorized into 4 different categories: assertions of incompetence, competition between women, the construction of women as objects, and the invalidation or derogation of women. So what did it show? It actually showed that on average, 11 such sexist remarks occurred per 10-minute conversation. And so this indicated that internalized sexism can be a routine social practice in women-to-women dialogue. And in the table, you can see the breakdown of the average frequency of each type of internalized sexist practice per pair of women. General ignorance claims were the most common. So the number of times that women said to other women, "I don't know" or "I can't," was pretty shocking. And it may seem innocuous at first. It may not seem like a big deal. "I don't know, I can't," until this turns into a belief that you really can't accomplish something. So the more you say, "I don't know, I can't," it eventually becomes a true belief that "I don't know, I can't." And what they noticed was these terms, these phrases of "I don't know" and "I can't" were much less commonly heard during conversations between men than during conversations between women. So now let's talk about really how does cult formation actually occur? Well, prejudice alone is not enough to result in an oppression, right? It requires that power differential. So while some women may carry out prejudicial acts against men, they do it without the backing of a societal system that recognizes women as in a position of power. So that doesn't lead to systemic oppression. However, when you have the prejudice plus that power differential, that can lead to systemic oppression, which we often see happen in our society with women. Then that systemic oppression leads to this concept, again, of internalized misogyny, where women start to believe in the things that men say about women and that other women say about women, and then that reinforces this internalized misogyny. And then that eventually can lead to this cult or subculture formation. So again, without that power differential, the systemic oppression can't occur, and therefore that internalized misogyny and cult formation can't occur. So all these factors have to be in place for a subculture or a cult to actually form. All right, so that brings me to the group called NXIVM. Let's talk about a couple of subculture cults. NXIVM was this bizarre sex cult that was founded by this man and this woman, Keith Raniere and Nancy Salzman, in 1998. And they pitched it as a personal development company offering executive success programs and other techniques aimed at self-improvement. They claimed that the main emphasis of the company and program was to have people experience more joy in their lives. And by 2003, they had 3,700 people taking part in their executive success programs, including businessmen and women, a former Surgeon General, an Enron executive, and other very famous and notable people. During these seminars, students were expected to call Keith Raniere Vanguard and Salzman Prefect. And Keith Raniere got this name Vanguard from an arcade game he actually played as a child, in which the destruction of enemies actually increases your own power. This is Allison Mack. You may remember her from the show Smallville. She was actually recruited by Nancy Salzman and Nancy Salzman's daughter Lauren around 2006. And she later played a pretty important pivotal role in the cult. She was really persuasive, even persuaded her parents to take part in the courses. And by the time she joined, NXIVM had developed quite a reputation for aggressively pursuing any critics or defectors, similar to Scientology. What was Jeunesse? Well, women in NXIVM were encouraged to enroll in this subgroup called Jeunesse, which is an all-female organization within NXIVM. And the curriculum in Jeunesse was kind of predicated on Raniere's belief that women's actions were primarily intended to attract male attention. So courses were taught by male mentors who would correct women's tone of voice, the way they sat, generally what they referred to as kind of antics to get attention from men. And they were taught to believe that monogamy was only for women, not for men. They were encouraged to go on extreme diets. And during one such exercise, women were told they were showing too much cleavage. So they were told to parade around like cows in a county fair, and they were awarded prizes by the men for their udders. There was an expose done in 2017 by the New York Times, and this was based on Sarah Edmondson. She's an actress who left NXIVM after being branded as part of a secret ritual, and she wanted to expose NXIVM for what it really was. And Miss Salzman, Nancy Salzman, had told Sarah that she wanted to share something really amazing with her about the secret society within NXIVM. It's even more secret than Jeunesse. But she needed to give her collateral first. And this collateral included naked photographs, other compromising material. And then she was allowed into the sisterhood called DOS, which stands for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which literally translates into Lord Master of the Obedient Female Companion. And she was told that they were hoping to grow this sisterhood into kind of a network so powerful they could influence elections and such. And they were, in order to overcome these weaknesses that Raniere taught were common to women, they had to overcome their over-emotional nature, a failure to keep promises, and this embrace of the role of victim. In this secret society called DOS, each circle was led by a master who recruited 6 slaves. And slaves were pretty much required to be at the master's beck and call. So during kind of exercises, a master would text her slave a question mark, and they had 60 seconds to reply, "Ready, master." And failing any task resulted in punishment. This is a picture of the brand they received. They called it a tattoo, and all the members of DOS were told that they would have to get this tattoo as part of the initiation. They were told to lie on a massage table while 3 other women restrained them. And then a doctor actually used a cottering device to sear this emblem below the woman's hip in their pelvis, which could take like 20 to 30 minutes. So it was a pretty painful process. And after Sarah Edmondson got this tattoo, she went, or branding, she went and told her husband, and that's when they decided to expose Nexium. And now if you look at a different angle of this brand, it either shows the initials of Keith Raniere or Allison Mack. So these women were actually being branded with people's initials. Well, as we know, Raniere was arrested in March of 2018, and he was charged with sex trafficking conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit forced labor. He was apparently having sex routinely with the members of the sisterhood. The doctor actually performing the branding was not investigated because it was determined she wasn't acting as the women's doctor when she did it. Allison Mack was also arrested the following month, and Nexium then suspended its operations. And Keith Raniere was convicted in June 2019 and sentenced to 120 years in prison. I want to talk about one other cult or club or group, whatever you want to call it. It's a less well-known but very interesting one called Sanctum. It's a highly secretive elite sex club and based and founded out of LA. Its founder is pictured here, Damon Lawner. He was a divorced father of 2 who struggled with monogamy, and he created Sanctum to have a meaningful conversation about sex, relationship, erotica, fetish, love, pain, and ultimately pleasure of the highest vibration. Tickets for one party are almost $2,000, and membership begins at $10,000 annually and goes up to $1 million. It's hosted high-profile guests, including Gwyneth Paltrow and Bill Maher. And if any of you remember the movie Eyes Wide Shut with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise, it's basically a real-life version of that movie. Now, this picture is risque. It's actually less risque than it originally was because I cropped it to make it less risque. But it's a picture that illustrates what goes on in these parties. But the parties usually start with erotic theater, followed by massive amounts of sexual exploration by the partygoers. Men wear tuxedos and women are scantily clad in lingerie. And women are told to pose in these compromising and demeaning positions, like as a table for drinks and as a lamp. On the left-hand side, I've cropped her out because she's topless, but that woman actually has a lampshade over her head. So she's standing acting like a lamp, essentially. Men have to pay for entry to the parties, either per party or by an annual membership, but women are admitted completely free of charge. All they have to do is submit a full photo of themselves, full body photo of themselves for the application. And there's only one requirement for women: hotness. If they aren't hot, they can't even pay to get in. Now, Lawner claims it's not about sex, it's about exploration. And he claims all of the women who attend the parties are sexually adventurous doctors and lawyers and professionals. But a lot of journalists who have actually been allowed to attend these parties have spoken to many of the women and said they're actually aspiring models and actresses trying to meet some rich and powerful men who can get them somewhere in their careers. So although it's professed to all be consensual, where all acts are voluntary, there is clearly a power differential, especially because women get in free of charge. They just have to look good, and men have to pay, and then women are put in these compromising positions, and a lot of these women are looking for career advances. So there is that power differential at play. So it's not a fully consensual sexual exploration club. So inherently, there is some sexism, and actually it goes to the extent of misogyny within this club. So let's go over some statistics then. 1 in 4 women experience severe intimate partner physical and sexual violence, and 1 in 5 women has been raped in their lifetime. From 2016 to 2018, the number of rape and sexual assaults increased by 150%. And what we know is that usually young, low income, and certain minorities are disproportionately affected by this violence. So how does misogyny lead to violence? Well, male self-esteem is often based on this concept of invulnerability, fearlessness, virility, and power, and always winning. And women have essentially become societal scapegoats when men's ego is threatened. And this has come from our patriarchal society, because we don't want to blame the male because we can't afford to have the male's self-esteem waver. So we use the women as kind of a scapegoat so that we can keep the men and their power intact. This systemic oppression of women reinforces this power, and the internalized misogyny that many women have also reinforces this power differential. It tends to be when men feel they're becoming powerless that they act out violently on women. Violence often results from that feeling of powerlessness. And so men who are acting out violently, they often have this shaken sense of self-esteem, but they don't want to show their fear, so they show violence instead as a way to show that dominance while masking their fear. Culturally, walking away from conflict is not seen as very masculine. And so if a man who already has a broken self-esteem walks away from conflict, it further hurts their self-esteem. So they feel they need to react. And finally, there's this concept of toxic masculinity, which refers to certain norms of masculine behavior in North America and Europe that are associated with harm to society and to men themselves. The social environment of boys as they grow up often normalizes this violence, especially when people say things like boys will be boys, because we never hear anybody saying things like girls will be girls. We don't hear that phrase very often, but we do hear the phrase boys will be boys very often. And so this phrase is characterized by this notion that men should suppress their emotions and act tough all the time, and then use violence as an indicator of power. And these values are often instilled from a very young age in environments where these traditional gender roles are understood and taught in a very, very strict manner. So now that we've explored the history of misogyny and how it can lead to cult formation and how it can lead to violence, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Fisher to talk more about incel and some of those cases of violence. So I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over to Dr. Fisher. Thank you. You're muted, Dr. Fisher.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm just going to take a minute to try to move this now to my screen share from the other one. That's not it. Are you seeing a part of the
No, we're not
slide?
seeing your slides. We're seeing my bio.
Okay.
Now we see your slides.
Some of it, not all of it, it looks like. See if I can move it. Let me try it again. Let me stop the screen share for a second. Okay, now are you seeing my slide?
Looks great.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to focus in a little bit more on the online subculture incel. Here's what we're going to go over. We're going to go over those beliefs, the recent violent acts, and what we can do as clinicians. Now, incel is short for involuntary celibacy, an internet subculture of men who blame women for the fact that they're not having sex. Dr. Sarathy already went over misogyny, misandry, And now I want to distinguish between celibacy, plain celibacy. People sometimes abstain from sexual intercourse for a number of reasons, maybe religious reasons, or they're focusing on their studies or some other thing. That's not what incel is. Incel is involuntary celibacy and usually defined as a period of 6 months or longer. So if someone feels like they've been involuntarily celibate for a week or two, that wouldn't qualify generally for that term of incel. In the incel subculture, they have a term called manosphere, which is a network of blogs and forums and web chats. And 4chan is one of the main ones where you'll find a lot of this stuff homed and housed. And it's defined as usually typically opposed to feminism, full of misogyny, and overlapping with parts of the alt-right. So that's what we're seeing here with the incel culture. Now, really, we have 4 subcultures here. We're going to focus on incels, but I just want to talk about MRA, men's rights activists. They have pickup artists, MGTOW, men going their own way, and incels, kind of all one and the same, but a few little differences here. MRA is seen on the website A Voice for Men, and their job, they believe, is to expose misandry on all levels. They denounce marriage as unsafe and unsuitable for modern men, and they promote an end to chivalry in all forms, educating about the threats in feminist governance. They aim to end rape, hysteria, and they promote civil disobedience and are against violence, they say. But with all their rhetoric, one might wonder if their readers would really heed. Now, MGTOW, in fact, even has its own symbol here. You can see it, the emblem there, that's called Men Going Their Own Way. Now, in that website, they have about 80 different terms, and almost all of them are derogatory toward women. And in case you're not familiar with the term sperm jacking, well, that is reaching into a garbage can to secretly extract the sperm from a discarded condom in an attempt to fertilize herself and then extort 216 monthly payments from an otherwise responsibly behaved man. So they warn, guard your sperm like Fort Knox, because there are no limits to what stunts a woman will pull with it. So again, we're going to focus on one of those subcultures, involuntarily celibate, or the incels. Now, the incels don't just blame women for their troubles. Oh no, they also blame men. And here you see the depiction of the incel being the lad in the gray sweater and navy blue pants, looking downwardly with sunglasses on. It looks like, some earbuds in. And then this other depiction is supposed to be a Chad. They call Chads, that's what they refer to, the good-looking men. The good-looking men are the ones that get all the good-looking women, which they describe as Stacys. So the incels, we'll hear a lot on their forums about Chads and Stacys, and they have a lot of hatred towards both groups. Now, you aren't going to find, typically, if you're on an airplane and glance over to see what someone's doing with their laptop up, you won't see a big incel, forum, because this is often done in secrecy. Now, not that they all wear black hoodies and sit in a darkened room, but the websites usually don't require any registration. The threads disappear within minutes. And so nobody nobody can trace them, and why it's just a constant problem. For one study at one time saw that 4chan had 703 million page views a month. And you can see that most of them are men, and many of the posts were negative towards women. Now, the incel culture talks about taking the red pill. That's joining us. Why don't you take the red pill and join us? It comes from the Matrix film of 1999. Some of you may have at least seen the rerun of it. And so it is when Keanu Reeves basically says, you can take the blue pill, or it said to Keanu Reeves, you can take the blue pill and you can make up whatever story you want to make up, or take the red pill. And I'll just show you how deep that rabbit hole goes. That rabbit hole is really referring to the incels' belief that women rule the world and that the men are the victims. So they say that taking the red pill is a bitter pill to swallow at first, to realize that this is the way our world is. But once you ingest it, it's refreshingly liberating after you have rid your mind of all that social conditioning. So believing again that most of our society is full of misandry and that the red pill is the way to freedom through the MGTOW. So how does this, is this just, some interesting political view or social view and, that we need to be aware of? Or does it really impact our lives with our patients and violence? Well, I want to take us to May 23, 2014 in Isla Vista, California, where there was this young man named Elliot Rodger. Here he is at age 22, and here is young Elliot. His father described him as a young boy as very, very, very shy. So he wasn't just a little shy. His father used the word very 3 times in describing how he was as a lad. Now, all was fine until, of course, he went to school. And when he went to school, he started having problems. He was bullied. He was made fun of. He didn't have friends. Well, they put him in therapy. In fact, he'd been in therapy since age 9. But he was still bullied. He still had a few friends. And by the age of 13, he'd walled himself into a cyber world. Now, his parents, in an effort to do the best for him, took him from high school to high school. In fact, finally, he was put into a special high school for kids with social challenges. He was in therapy for all these years, and some people had thought about, well, does he have Asperger's? Never formally diagnosed, however. Others had raised concerns about suicide, but again, never been determined that he was at risk for certain. Well, in 2013, 2014, he started posting some videos that looked pretty aggressive. In fact, he went out and legally purchased 3 handguns. Well, in some of these videos, he talked about going into a Starbucks and looking at a couple kissing, and he threw hot coffee on them. And another time he was at a party and he saw girls having fun on a ledge, and he talked about wanting to go over and push them off. His mother saw these videos. Now she became very concerned. And she called the authorities and said, he's at school, UC Santa Barbara. Please go check on him. Please make sure he's okay. I don't know what's going on. This doesn't look good to me. So they went. They did a welfare check. Of course, he said he was fine. No problems. They did not search his apartment. They did not find the guns, nor did they do a check on whether he had purchased guns. Well, he finally finished a manifesto. It was 137 pages of writing. And he published his last videos. He called the manifesto My Twisted World, quite appropriately named. And in there, he said, look at me, I'm gorgeous. But you girls don't see it. My problem is girls. I've tried asking you out, but if I try anymore, you'll just continue to reject me. Life is not fair. Well, finally, tomorrow will be the day of retribution. In his manifesto, he referred to himself as lonely 48 times. 6 times he said he had no friends, none. He described himself as having hate or hatred 184 times. And he's talked about his need to get revenge or feel like he was going to get retribution 100 times. He emailed the manifesto to his parents and therapist. His plan was to go to his home and to kill his roommates and then go kill his stepmother and younger brother. His parents had divorced. His father had remarried. He felt like he no longer had a place in the home, but that his younger brother was favored. So he thought his father's going to be out of town this day. I'm going to go kill my stepmother, my younger brother, and my roommates. Well, father's plans changed, and he was going to be at home. So then he did not carry out the plan to kill his stepmother and younger brother. But he did kill the roommates, James Hong, David Wong, and then poor George Chin. It was not his roommate, just stopped by to, say hello, and he ended up killing him as well. After he finished that, he went to the Alpha Phi sorority. And why that one? He said, well, because it has all the hottest girls. His plan was to go through the door and kill every girl inside, but fortunately, the door was locked and nobody went and opened the door for him. So he ended up just shooting girls on the lawn in the area, and he ended up killing Catherine Cooper, Veronica Weiss. Then he started driving through the streets of Isla Vista, shooting people, and he shot Christopher Michaels Martinez, age 20, who was just walking into the deli to buy a sandwich. Well, all in all, he killed 6, wounded 13, and when the police shot him in the leg, he then turned his gun on himself and died by suicide. After the fact, people wrote on the streets of Isla Vista, and if you'll notice, the words "give us love" there in the middle rather, is thought to be a reference to the incel ideology that you either, you hot girls either give us love or there will be more violence. Now, this is his father, who was interestingly a movie producer involved in the Hunger Games and some other things. And so Peter Rogers was interviewed for this, and he said, he was obsessed with online forums, and I was so worried about him. He was obsessed with losing his virginity. In fact, I was so worried. In desperation, I said, well, let's just go to Las Vegas and find a legal brothel. But actually, Elliot said, no, that's not what I want. I want to be wanted. And so he refused that offered by his father. Now, this is so interesting. This is Peter Rogers. And this is other man with the glasses is the father of the young man who was killed walking into the deli shop. And they determined that they were going to do all they could together to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Now, some of you think that, well, this is all maybe just this, our social media and things. I want to take us back to 1989 in Montreal, Quebec. Marc Lapine, age 25, his father had abused his mother and he'd watched all that. He grew up and he described himself. He said, I'm also against feminism like my father was, but, I do want a girlfriend. He had a few friends, but he was awfully bullied. Well, after high school, he thought, I'm going to apply to join the military. Well, he was rejected. Okay, well, I'll get a job as a custodian. Well, he was fired from that. And he said, he wrote that, life has just been so difficult for the last 7 years. I think I'll just try to go to engineering school. He applied, but he was rejected. And then he decided, okay, I've had enough. He walked into an engineering class of 60 students. He asked the men to leave. 10 women remained, rather. And he killed 14 in all, 12 remained, and 12 engineering students, 1 nursing student, and 1 staff. And one woman in the engineering class protested, said, I'm not a feminist. I just want to be an engineer. And he said, it's the same, and killed them anyway. And then he also died by suicide. Canada remembers this day, called the National Day of Remembrance, and action of violence against women. Here they have a marker of change in Vancouver. It's 14 benches to commemorate the lives of those women. Well, in 2009, Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, George Sarathy, age 49, he was a law firm IT tech. He wanted a girlfriend, but wasn't having much luck. So he read books and attended seminars on seduction. Some of you may not have known that they actually have seminars on seduction. And he was a journaler. He journaled, I've had no girlfriend since 1984. He wrote this on Christmas Eve 2008. Now that's about 24 years. No sex since July of 1990. I've been rejected by 30 million women. That's an awful, awful lot. And he wrote what turned out to be his last internet post. Thanks for nada, bitches. Bye. And after that, he went into the LA Fitness where he'd been taking some classes. He turned off the lights and began shooting, killing 3 women, firing 50 shots, injuring 9 others. And then he also killed himself. In Roseburg, Oregon, 2015, Christopher Harper Mercer, age 26. Now, his story was that he had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. He was on meds till age 18, but then he stopped. Didn't want to take them anymore. Now, he owned 9 guns, had access to many more at home. But he enrolled in college, didn't do so well, so he joined the Army, came back, and tried again, and put on scholastic probation in September. Well, he posted this anonymous, well, it was anonymous, but believed to be attributed to him. Excuse me, let me go back 1 slide. Some of you guys are all right. Don't go to school tomorrow if you're in the Northwest. Happening thread will be posted tomorrow morning. So long, space robots. And the next day he went into his Umpqua Community College into Snyder Hall, where he'd been taking a basic writing class. He said, okay, get in the middle. He killed 8 students, 1 professor, a student in a wheelchair. When he told him to stand up, said she couldn't stand, tried to get back in the chair, killed her too, injured 9 others, and then killed himself. Now, there was 1 lucky student. He said, you know what? I'm giving you the flash drive. I want you to give this to the authorities. So he wanted his cause to be heard. In this flash drive, he expressed frustration because he was a virgin, said he had studied the Isle Vista killings. Again, Elliot Rodger. And the next day, after the shootings, after he killed himself, others had posted a Chris Harper Mercer is a hero page on Facebook. And there was also a Twitter account which said, yeah, I shot at that school and enjoyed it. So what? 4chan enjoyed it too. 2018, Toronto, Canada, Alec Manassian, age 25. Now, he was socially awkward, few friends. Asperger's syndrome had been diagnosed. He was in special classes for autism. In high school, he'd been noted to say, I'm afraid of girls. Tried the military, but he failed. Tried work as a software developer. Finally finished his college, and he posted this. April 19th, 2018. And then he said, also, the Incel rebellion has already begun. We will overthrow all the Chads and the Stacys. All hail the supreme gentleman, Elliot Rodger. He took a van and plowed through the streets of Toronto. Pictures of the van there. At the end, he tried to get the police to shoot him. He pretended he had a gun in his pocket, told them to shoot me in the head, but the police didn't. They put him in custody, and he was charged with murdering 10 and attempting to murder 16. One of those who was injured later died, and it was changed to 11. So again, he tried to die by a suicide. He didn't have a gun, so he pretended to have one, trying to get the police to shoot him. In Tallahassee, Florida, we find a similar story with Scott Byerly, age 40. He had been a substitute teacher, fired from that for inappropriate conduct with the girls, tried serving in the military, but he was dishonorably discharged. He was found to be trespassing into women's locker areas and had arrests for grabbing women without consent. He wrote some vlogs in 2014 and voiced common incel grievances, and compared himself to Elliot Rogers. Well, he went into this hot yoga studio, and in there he shot 6, killed 2, and then also killed himself. In Provo, Utah, Christopher Cleary, age 27. He was a YouTuber, went by Chris with a K. In there, you can see he would have just YouTube about nothing. You can see his cat behind him there if you look closely. He had 2 cats, one named Precious and one named Buttercup. He would just make these videos describing what he did that day. I went and I got a used chair. I walked it all the way to my apartment. People were looking at me. I felt subconscious. And I just felt like, I just wish more people would pay attention. Nobody even watches my videos. Thank you for those of you who do. I usually get 1 or 2. Maybe I'll get 3. So he was lonely. He had difficulty with employment. He had been charged with assault, harassment via the phone, and he'd been on probation for felony stalking and threatening women. In fact, one judge said, I'm going to order you to get mental health treatment. You've got some kind of impulse control disorder. And he had taken some medication for that. Well, in January 2019, he put on social media, all I wanted ever was a girlfriend. All I wanted was to be loved. No one cares about me. I've never had a girlfriend before. In fact, I'm still a virgin, and this is why I'm going to do it. I'm going to be killing as many girls as I see. I'm going to be shooting up a public place soon. I will be the next mass murderer. In fact, then he wrote something that none of us should ever forget. As an uneducated man, he wrote something very, very important. There's nothing more dangerous than a man ready to die. We need to remember that. We'll come back to that in a bit. Well, there were these women marches planned for the end of January. Fortunately, someone saw his post, called authorities, put it together that he might have been talking about going to one of these women's marches. That might have been what he was planning. And he was arrested at a McDonald's in Provo, Utah. He begged the police, please just kill me. Please just handcuff me to a tree in a desert and let me die there so nobody can hear me scream. Here he is on trial. And he talked about being in the incel movement. The clinical warnings for this are a thwarted sense of belongingness. You notice with each of these stories, and there have been so many others, where they don't belong really anywhere other than in their incel group. They have rejections, multiple rejections in their life, and they feel isolated. They have a sense of hopelessness. They don't know anything that they can do to change their situation. They're in deep psychological pain. They have a means. Each one, they weren't always guns. Sometimes, in fact, the initial instrument used by Elliot Rogers was a knife in killing his roommates, because he thought it was be quieter. So he did that. And also important to remember that in our patients with suicidal thoughts, it's socially acceptable to say, yeah, I'm having suicidal thoughts. Homicidal thoughts will be, I think there's more of a reluctance of people to share that. But when someone is suicidal, to always be thinking about, are others at risk too? Now, they may deny homicidality if we ask them, but maybe we need to ask about if they've ever been very angry at a group of people or angry at a particular person. They might talk about that, feeling very frustrated or having a lot of feelings of hatred toward a group, even though they won't report that they feel homicidal towards them. We need to explore also our patient's sexual history and their expectations. Again, sometimes people are voluntarily celibate, but when people are expecting that they should not be celibate, and it's because they feel like it's other people's fault, that is something that would be helpful for us to know. It's helpful for us to explore what online forums that they are frequenting and their gun history. Do you own any? Do you have access? Do you wish you did? Do you plan to own one? Treatment considerations include behavioral intervention technologies. There are many softwares, many apps, things that can help give people more of a feeling of belonging to healthy groups so that they don't have to join incel or unhealthy groups. De-radicalization, which may first include disengagement, which may need the help of others. And to do away with one, you have to replace it with something else. So we must keep that in mind. It will be a lot of cognitive behavioral approaches with this and putting the support structures in place. Regardless of what was true for these individuals, many of them felt like they didn't have support in this world. They had nowhere to turn. And with that, I'm going to end and open it up for any questions or comments.
I can start off. Or hold on. So someone's raising their hand. Let me see who that is. Oh, it's Nick. Here we go. Okay, gotcha. All right, Nick, you're unmuted.
Hi, it's good to meet you all, and thank you for that talk. I found it very interesting. My question, I'm not sure the best way to put it, but I'll just try to be as clear as I can. There is a rise in, I guess, virtual AI companionship apps and things like that of this nature. How do you see the incel community reacting to this? Is it going to be something that maybe makes people kind of not caring so much, or is it going to be something like that's not real and they want like the validation of being loved by a real person?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you what, I think that, some of these cases, they are going to internet already for companionship, and that's how they're becoming radicalized. So I think those are good tools as first steps. I think the other thing is that so many of these cases involved either a diagnosis of Asperger's or autism spectrum disorders, and others where it had been raised but not maybe diagnosed. But there's very little information about whether they were in treatment for social skills training and things like that. So I think it's a multifactorial, we have to use all sorts of tools, but I think the AI approaches are good. It's one tool to be used, but it wouldn't be enough in and of itself. There has to be additional supports in place and feelings of, I guess, but I think it's a helpful place to start.
That makes sense. Thank you.
What can we look for in our patients to spot these patterns of behavior?
Yeah, I think that most of these cases went undiagnosed. You know, nobody knew. They were in therapy, but the therapists never knew, or the clinicians never knew that they were involved in the forums. And arguably, maybe a few years ago, it wasn't talked about. We didn't even know it was occurring. So I think a lot of it is a lot of question seeking, of course, to find out if people will share with us. And even if they won't share with us what forums they're in, we can find out, you know, what support structures they have in place. And if we find patients who are completely isolated and, you know, they don't have a feeling of belonging, where do you belong? Who are your friends? And if they say they don't have friends, because that can seem pretty safe to say, I don't have friends. Maybe they won't feel safe in saying, well, I hate women, or I hate good-looking men, I hate good-looking women. They might feel safe to say, I have no friends. Helping them get into supports that will help them develop that friendship, support groups where they can feel like they have at least the belongingness to that healthy support group, which can start to interact, I guess, combat some of the effects that they're having from the radicalization online. So I think we can only do what we know, but I think we need to know that regardless of whether we know that they're in the incel group yet or not, or some other unhealthy hate group yet or not, that if we have patients who are saying, look, I have no one, I don't have a support group, I have no friends, and that we can build the supports, and they need those because otherwise they are vulnerable to developing unhealthy alliances.
All
Dr.
right,
Sarathy, if you want to jump in here anytime.
Hi, this is Dr. Huang. This is a very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. I just want to share an anecdote I heard somewhere. So basically in Antarctic, there's all the scientists doing research on the base, isolated, base. And then so there's some post in the restroom saying, please stop hoarding women. So I think it's kind of natural phenomena, sort of like this kind of sexual attraction. It's not like, evenly distributed. So there are always this kind of social hierarchy. The good looking, people get more like, attention, that kind of thing. So, but I think you're talking about it's like, so whether certain things are maintaining social structure or disrupting social structure, social order. So maintaining this hierarchy or disruptive that. So it sounds like this kind of incel kind of people, they're not happy with, at least from their perception, the resources not evenly distributed, and then they're taking up arms, to do something about it. Is that sort of, do you think that's sort of almost like a natural social phenomenon, and then they just went to the extreme?
I'm not sure if I'll try to speak to what I think maybe your question is.
Sure.
And because I'm not sure I understood what if there's anything natural taken to the extreme. I'm not seeing that anything is natural taken to the extreme. I think that if you look at each of these stories, and of course we could go through more, there's so many more, but the things they have in common, again, is they're just feeling rejected. Let's say they didn't want a girlfriend. Let's just take that off they still felt rejected from the world. right? Most of them were rejected from employment. They didn't have a strong tie to family. Even if the family desperately loved them, they had felt put aside in some way. They often were, if they were in academics, they had been rejected, often in academics. And then, and they had many times, again, some diagnosis of Asperger's or question, or autism spectrum or question. So isolation, rejection is kind of that common theme. So any patient we have with kind of that constant isolation and rejection, common theme, it was over and over in their life. People are going to belong somewhere, right? They're vulnerable. That's kind of like putting on they might as well wear it on their forehead, vulnerable. And these days with all the internet, right, of any kind of hate group, but the incel group is one that we're talking about today that is welcoming. And yes, you know, the problem is women, the problem is men. Okay, yeah, that's the problem. And that's been their focus. I think that's very unnatural. I don't see it as a continuation of anything, I guess, natural. And I think that the focus.
No, I'm trying to say there's always also this social hierarchy, you know, so nobody is equal to each other, you know, there are always difference.
I see.
And
So you're trying to say, why don't these, why did they only go after the hot girls? Is that kind of where you're at? Like, why did they?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying
Okay.
basically, you know, sort of like, no, how does this work out, like say in the deer society, in the mammal society, you know,
So
basically.
I think I understand where you're going with this, with the statement about the Arctic, and the North Pole. But
Sure.
and if resources are scarce, like what would we do if we were stranded on an island and we had no resources? How would we react to that? So I think from what I'm understanding is what you're saying is that it's a normal human reaction when resources are scarce to want to hoard those resources instead of giving it to other people. Am I understanding that correct?
Maybe attractive man, attractive woman always gonna get more partners compared to the unattractive one.
Sure,
Isn't that normal?
Sure, but we have to remember that also attraction is in the eye of the beholder, right? So attraction isn't a standardized thing. If attraction was standardized, then we would probably see a lot more of this behavior. But attraction in general is not standardized, and what people are attracted to differ. Even within men and women, what people are attracted to is different. It's not always to physical appearance, right? And so I don't think it's necessarily about attraction.
But there's still kind of universal standards about beauty, you know, attraction, that kind of thing.
Sure, and I think that was the case more historically than it is today, though, right? What we see in today's society is a shifting. And I think part of what causes the incel movement to thrive right now is that shifting, is that people don't like when societal norms change. And so this is oftentimes a reaction to those types of changes. And so I think previously there were these standardized concepts. I think that's changing in today's society. And people don't like change. And when people are experiencing that change, I think that's when people tend to become a little more radicalized.
But so is the incel movement disruptive to the social norm? Oh, you know, sort of like, they're disruptive to the social chain. I think they're disruptive to the social norm.
That's a good question. I think I could argue both ways on that. I feel like I could argue they're disruptive to the social norm as well as to the social chain, though, because I think the social change is, again, I think the social change is changing. And when the social chain is changing in today's society, as women are becoming more prominent, as women are getting more equal wages, more equal jobs, more equal opportunities, then this incel movement has grown. Why? Because I think they do want to, in some ways, disrupt that chain as well as the norm, if that makes sense.
Yes. So what's the solution? You know, sort of, are we gonna cease to be a free society? Are we gonna take a more authoritarian approach? You know, sort of, what's the solution?
I don't know that we have a great solution for this, but one thing I remember Dr. Oliva's question at the end of our APA talk about, I think he brought up the example of sports and engaging in sports, like boys engaging in sports. And although that may seem controversial as social norms change, is that a healthy thing? And my response to him was that I think that technology and social media and video games have placed people in this alternate reality. And they're doing that more than they are engaging with other people in reality. And I think that is very disruptive. And that leads to these formations of communities like Incel. So I think the more we encourage our youth, to actually engage with other people, because what you find is a lot of kids these days don't know how to talk to people. They don't know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to engage with each other, except when they're on video games. Then they can engage great over a video game, but they can't do it in real life. And if we're teaching our youth how to engage appropriately with other people in real life, I think that will decrease and minimize some of the impact of these online groups that form.
Just going off that, if I may engage. So yeah, I remember we met at the APA for the initial talk. And one other question, I can't remember if I asked it then, but have there been studies or any interventions looking at group therapy for people in incel communities, incel habits? Because like you said, one of the biggest issues that I think we've noticed is people are way too online now. I think the pandemic made that worse. And looking at social engagement in a group therapy setting.
I'm not sure if there have been any studies about that. That would be interesting. And Dr. Fisher can speak maybe more to if there are studies on that, but my only concern with the group therapy with this particular community might be that without the proper moderation, it might actually further the extremism and the isolationism, because you're putting them actually together in real life. Right now, they're together more online. Then you put them together in real life. You might want more of an intermingling as a group as opposed to just a group. So I would be curious to know how that would pan out. Dr. Fisher, are you aware of any studies?
No, I think that I'm not aware of any studies on that. I think people are trying a number of things, but I think again, the identification of it is really what we can. I think once we identify it, and I think that's where, again, each of these cases was never identified. We can do a lot for our individual patients.
I've got to run in a little bit. So thank you guys for an excellent presentation. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I agree with the bringing the folks together in group therapy session. Like the old school VA rap groups kind of had a negative effect, I think, on PTSD is what the data showed with the group therapy. My question to you is there any kind of evidence surrounding de-radicalization of individuals? People that have been identified and have been de-radicalized, and if so, what does the evidence show as being the most effective form of therapeutic care that was provided to facilitate de-radicalization?
So I do want to say really quickly, it is 1 o'clock, so our time is up. We can definitely continue the discussion as long as people are available to stay and converse with our speakers, but I also want to respect their time as well as the time of the residents and faculty present. If you all want to take Dr. Faruqi's question, and then maybe we can end our session.
So I think that, de-radicalization would be one, disengagement. It's hard to do, very difficult to do. But one is disengagement from the forums, the exposure that they're getting. And then the second would be really a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy to help them think about their circumstances in a different way and come to different assessments of what's going on around them regarding their own behaviors, because oftentimes these incels were also pushing others away in ways. And so it's compounded with, of course, their autism or Asperger's that was probably never identified early enough, never treated early enough. They miss social cues more likely than not, which then makes it much more difficult.
And I haven't done a lot of research into actual de-radicalization and how that would work and how that would play out in reality. So I don't think I could attest much to the research of de-radicalization. I don't think it, from what I understand, has been that effective thus far. And I do wonder why. And I wonder if we take an approach, and I've always been of this mindset, if instead of taking a de-radicalization approach, we take an approach similar to how we deal with delusional disorders, if that might change what we see and how we see it being effective or ineffective. I tend to always look at these cases as on a spectrum of delusions and overvalued ideas. And so if we take an approach more like we usually do with delusional disorders, as opposed to focusing on the issue of de-radicalization, if that might not be more effective.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for being here with us. We appreciate your time and expertise and everything like that. Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.